think we're live. I'm actually not sure. YouTube is always screwing these things up. Have you ever wondered if there's good evidence for the Bible that is historically accurate? I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief on my channel, Capturing Christianity. In today's live stream, we're going to take a close look at evidence for the Bible that's taken a lot of us, including apologists and philosophers, by surprise. It's actually been around a little while, but it's taken the work of some really brilliant philosophers to bring this to light, bring it back to light. The technical name for it, for this kind of evidence, is undesigned coincidences. The basic idea is that there are these sort of unintended connections between the Gospels, between the Gospel accounts, that tell us that basically real people were writing this based on their experiences. And so who I have with me today is Lydia McGrew. Let me go ahead and switch to my scene here. It's great to have you on, Lydia. I'll give a little introduction to my audience who may not know you. You're a widely published analytic philosopher, homeschooling mother, you're a blogger, and the wife of philosopher and apologist Timothy McGrew, who I've also had on the show. Both of you guys are very dear to my heart. Your article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology is awesome. I love it. I've read through it, and I've had great discussions with other people about it too. So
it's great to be here, Cameron. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. Is there anything else that the audience would need to know about you and your work?
No, they can follow me on Facebook to see what's coming up, what's being published. I've just published a new book recently, and today we'll be talking about that one just a little bit, and then even more about my 2017 book, Hidden in Plain View.
Awesome. Yeah, so today we're talking about Undesigned Coincidences, but we will talk about your latest book and maybe even have you back on to talk more in depth about that one, because it's a really interesting part of this whole discussion that I think needs a little bit more light as well. But let's get to it. So if you're interested in apologetics and you want to see more discussions between Christians and non-Christians, you just want to learn more about philosophy and religion, make sure to subscribe to my channel, hit that little bell so you can be notified when I post new videos. Before we get into the interview, this is just a quick reminder that I support my wife and 2 kids through this ministry. So if you find value in the work that I do here, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. For $5 a month or more, you can gain early access to all my videos, and you can also gain access to our private Facebook group called The Brands, where we just post little things and have a good time in there for all the people who are patrons of Capturing Christianity. All right, well, let's just hop right into it. So give me a quick summary of the arguments for the reliability of Scripture, Lydia, that you've come across in your studies. What are some of the broad categories?
So generally, the broadest categories for the reliability of the Bible, be it the Old Testament or the New Testament, are considered internal and external. And so external would be things like archaeology or little bits of information about customs of the time or something that are referred to in Scripture. Those kinds of things where we're connecting it with the other historians or inscriptions.
Someone like Tacitus.
Yeah, Tacitus, or just inscriptions that we find on stones or whatever. So those would be external. And then internal would include things like what we're going to talk about today about undesigned coincidences. And in fact, there's quite a wide variety of internal evidences for Scripture that have not been widely known, that I'm actually trying to bring out even beyond undesigned coincidences. It's also important to realize that internal evidences for Scripture are not question begging. Even though it's an internal evidence, that doesn't mean that it starts by, assuming that the Bible is the Word of God or assuming that the Bible is inerrant or something. Rather, what we do is we look at the document itself and we see if there's signs from the nature of the document itself that it's true. And so we're comparing those signs to other information that maybe we have about what truthful testimony looks like and that sort of thing. So there's still an external check on it, even though it's internal information.
Yeah, and I think it'd be helpful maybe to give some examples of, we do this with other literature and other sources in other cases, so we don't just do this with the Bible.
That's correct.
And I'm speaking specifically about internal evidence.
Yes.
J. Warner Wallace talks about this a lot in his work, is how between 2 witnesses, if there are different details that sort of overlap, then that lends veracity or lends credibility to each of their testimonies that they give. If there are details that sort of overlap in a way that doesn't really seem like they were trying to plan it.
Right.
And that's where it's actually important that the 2 words that go back to back here, undesigned coincidences, both of them are really, really important. So let's talk about the phrase itself. Like, why do we need undesigned, and then why do we need coincidences for
Sure.
this phrase to really make sense and do all this work?
So it's useful to note that the word coincidence there is originally an older use of that term. So this term was coined by William Paley in the late 1700s. So that's going back a little bit. And so when he said coincidence, he meant something like coincidence. So coming together, connection, not coincidence in the sense like, oh, it just happened that way. It's totally chance. In fact, the whole point is that it's not chance, that it's because these actually are both based on reality. So undesigned means that the authors are not trying to fit them together. I'll sometimes say an undesigned coincidence is an incidental interlocking that points to truth. But I want to add to that, it's a casual incidental interlocking that points to truth. So I sometimes give a contemporary sort of made-up example, and I've got several of these that I'll use. Suppose that one morning you're at work, and one of your co-workers comes in late, and he says, "I'm sorry, I'm late today. There was an accident at this particular intersection," and he names the intersection. And so I had to go around. And then later on, like many hours later, another worker comes in, and he comes in quite a bit later. And he says, "I'm sorry I'm late." He said, "I drove through this intersection," and he names the same intersection, "and I got a flat tire because there was glass in the intersection." So the first person does not mention anything about there being glass, although he mentions an accident which could have caused glass on the road. The second person does not mention anything about an accident, but he got a flat tire, he says, because there was glass in the intersection. So that's an example, kind of a simple example of an undesigned coincidence. These two people do not appear to be trying to corroborate one another, but they name things that causally do fit together. That the accident could cause glass, and that could cause the flat tire. So that's an example of how they're coming together. The coincidence is important, but it also appears to be undesigned.
Yeah, so let's talk about the design part again. So if these accounts were designed, what would that look like, and why would that not count toward reliability?
Right. So suppose that one. So let me just point out, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're telling a falsehood, but suppose that one person's overheard the other person mention the accident, and his overhearing it isn't necessarily the problem. But suppose he said, "Yes, and by the way, I can confirm that because I noticed glass in the intersection." All right. Now, that's still interesting and everything, but he's attempting to confirm what the other person said. He's explicitly attempting. And so that would appear different. That would not appear casual in this way where it's like they don't appear to be trying to confirm one another. They just do confirm one another.
Yeah, so that wouldn't lend any more credence to the other guy's testimony. Right?
Oh,
it would just be
lend,
sort of the same where it was.
It would lend some, but a lot more at that point would depend upon your antecedent confidence that these guys are telling the truth. Okay. If the second guy, if you have reason to think of him as a liar or something, or if they're really good friends or something, and they might be trying to help each other out in some way, then you've got more of a concern because he's admitting that he's trying to confirm the other guy's testimony. So a lot more at that point depends upon your independent information about how reliable these people are. Whereas when they don't appear to be attempting to confirm one another, but they do confirm one another, that's a particularly powerful thing, because even if you don't really know very much about how reliable these guys are, that gives a real boost to your confidence that they're reliable.
And the reason why we're doing some of this work up front is because it's really important to understand the concept itself, as I was trying to study and learn more about undesigned coincidences, because when I first started out, I wasn't super convinced that this was good evidence. And so as I started to study and look more into it and really understand what the concept meant, how it all sort of tied together, and how it's not just one case, it's multiple cases, and so they sort of stack together. This is actually a really good time to talk about circumstantial evidence and how multiple lines of evidence that may not seem super strong on their own, once you combine enough evidence, basically you can build a really strong case out of just circumstantial evidence. Let's talk about that a little.
Right. So often we will say that the argument from undesigned coincidences is part of a cumulative case. And what we really get is sort of cumulative cases within cumulative cases. You can think of this hierarchy. So now here's undesigned coincidences. We have a bunch of those that form a cumulative case. And then here's like incidental external confirmations, and we have a bunch of those. So, and then over here might be what I call unexplained allusions. Maybe we could talk about that later. We got a bunch of those and so forth. We've got all these different things. And so it's like each one is a cumulative case within itself, but then we've got different types of them, which also forms a cumulative case at that level of types of arguments. So that's very cool that we've got sort of stacked layers of cumulative evidence for reliability. So now in legal terms, sometimes circumstantial evidence is distinguished from what's thought of as direct evidence. So direct evidence might be a author saying, I saw this happen, or this happened. He directly testifies. So suppose in the Gospels, for example, we have all four Gospels tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000. That's direct evidence that the feeding of the 5,000 occurred. They all say that it occurred, although they have different details and different wording. Circumstantial evidence is some other kind of evidence that might, for example, confirm the direct evidence or confirm the truthfulness of the author. Now, this is important because, after all, when you have direct evidence, you may say, okay, but how do I evaluate that direct evidence? Is this person someone I can trust? How strong of a boost does that direct evidence give to that which it attests? So circumstantial evidence, by coming along and independently confirming that person's reliability, can then mean that his direct evidence is of greater value. We have more undesigned coincidences connected with the feeding of the 5,000 than with any other incident in all of Scripture, which is kind of interesting, and in all of the Gospels. J.J. Blunt was an author in the 19th century who wrote about undesigned coincidences, and he has this interesting quotation about the feeding of the 5,000. He says, here again, I maintain, we have strong indications of veracity in the case of a miracle itself, and I leave it to others who may have ingenuity and inclination for the task to weed out the falsehood of the miracle from the manifest reality of the circumstances which attend it, and to separate fiction from fact, which is in the very closest combination with it. So that's kind of interesting that the circumstantial evidence actually helps to confirm the direct evidence.
Well, we already started to get into some details about, so we're about to switch over and start talking about some concrete examples of undesigned coincidences that you really like. So what is like maybe your top one? What is your favorite one to go to explain when you're trying to explain this?
Answer that question. Like, the top one is the one that I'm most enthusiastic about today. It's the new one that I most recently thought of, and I'm like, man, that is cool. And so I've been doing, for example, a lot of work on the Gospel of John recently. I have some connecting John with what are called the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But I'll do the one that I was just alluding to because people like this one. So sometimes I go with what strikes an audience. So there's a rhetorical issue there too. But if people in the audience don't like one that I give, get a copy. Get a copy of Hidden in Plain View, because each person has their own personal favorites. So here's one. I did
want to mention before you give this, if you want to get her book, it's linked in the description of this video, as well as the more recent book that she's worked on that we're going to talk about at the end of this video. So if you want to get a hold of her book, just check the link in the description. That's all I have.
Absolutely. So at the time of the feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of John, Jesus is sort of, I like to say, he's trolling the disciples. He likes to tease them sometimes. So there's like thousands of people, 5,000 men plus women and children. And he turns to Philip and he says, where can we buy bread that these may eat? Now, there's no question of their actually buying bread, okay? And it says that in John. He himself knew what he would do. Now, he might have just picked Philip at random. There's 12 disciples, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which one did he decide to ask this slightly teasing question to? Because Philip immediately says, come on, there's no way we have enough money to buy bread for all of these people. But we can ask a question. If we're taking, I like to use the term test drive, if we're taking for a test drive that this is a true story, we can say, why did he ask Philip? Why did he pick Philip? And so that might be interesting, because if it really happened, then there might have been a reason why he picked Philip. Now, if you go to Luke, completely separate gospel, Luke says that this event took place in a deserted area belonging to the town of Bethsaida. Okay, so he just mentions that. He didn't say anything about Philip. Luke doesn't mention that little dialogue with Philip. Now we go back to John, to two completely different passages, not connected with the feeding of the 5,000 at all. One of them is at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry when we first meet Philip, and another one is toward the end in chapter 12 when some Greeks come to Philip and ask to see Jesus. And John just throws in there, sort of apropos of nothing, Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, so he throws that in there for no apparent reason. He's just kind of mentioning it in passing. And this, by the way, is part of what I mean by an unexplained allusion. If you get a person talking about things that he remembers, he will throw in those kinds of pointless details. That does actually happen. It's sort of a mark of oral history. Okay, now you put all these three together, and a possible, and I would say plausible explanation is that Jesus is saying to Philip as a local, where can we buy bread that these people may eat? So there's a reason for him to pick Philip to ask that question to. But again, it appears very undesigned. John does not mention that the event took place near Bethsaida, and he even mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida in context totally unconnected with the feeding of the 5,000. And nobody else mentions this bit of dialogue with Philip. In fact, I doubt myself that John was even really thinking about that as the reason why Jesus asked it. I think he just knew that Jesus did ask Philip that question. So that's an example of an undesigned coincidence. And people find that one interesting because it does not appear that these authors are attempting to confirm one another, but they do confirm one another.
Right. What's the number one pushback that you get to this example?
Well, I don't know about this example particularly, but I do see, and let me just say, scholars are not really answering this. I mean, scholars who are skeptical or whatever aren't.
They're not engaging it.
They're not engaging it. Bart Ehrman had an engagement with my husband on the Unbelievable show a few years ago, supposedly about this. And the strongest thing that Bart Ehrman said was, well, this sounds very 19th century. And it's not really an answer, Oh, what is this, some kind of 19th century apologetic? Well, okay, a little chronological snobbery there. But there are two kinds of objections that I get from popular skeptics and sort of popular objectors. One is what I call the hyper-subtle deceptive author objection, and the other is what I call the source objection. So the hyper-subtle deceptive author is that in this case, the way that would go would be that John, he just super subtly put that in about Philip being from Bethsaida in these other passages because he was sort of hoping that people might later make these connections to Luke. Now, I consider that extremely implausible because it could so easily fail. When people try to confirm their own accounts, they're not generally that subtle when they're making something up. If he wanted to try to put that in there, he could easily have said, now Philip was from Bethsaida, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and this was taking place near Bethsaida, and so Jesus said to Philip, where near here can we buy bread? But he doesn't do anything like that. That type of hyper subtlety is not characteristic of forgers and people who are faking things, because honestly, you could have all your work for nothing. So then the second would be what I call the source type of objection. So in an source objection, you invent out of whole cloth, and I'm not talking about Q or something here that scholars are already hypothesizing. I'm talking about an entirely hypothetical source where you'll say, well, maybe there was some source out there that contained all of this stuff. So the way that would look like in this would be, well, maybe there was some version of this story that really did say that Philip was from Bethsaida in that story, and that Jesus asked him this for this reason, and that this took place near Bethsaida. And then the different authors just accidentally sort of grab different parts of that version. Now, that violates Occam's razor. Occam's razor says, do not multiply entities without necessity. Because what we're doing is we're trying to put something instead of reality. Now, what I would say is reality contains all these aspects. Reality contains Philip and the town and this conversation and so forth. And so then what you're doing is you're saying, instead of reality, I'm going to make up this entirely hypothetical source, and I'm going to put that in there, for which we have no independent evidence whatsoever, and I'm going to put it in there instead. Sometimes people will use the term oral tradition. And that's something I hear, unfortunately, from some Christians as well. They'll use the term oral tradition as an objection to undesigned coincidences. Now, the problem with this is that oral tradition is not one thing. Oral tradition is just a kind of a basket term for, this person told this story in this way, and this person, this apostle or whatever, told this story in this way. Now, if you have different apostles telling it differently, that just takes us back to the undesigned coincidence to begin with. And we've got Luke's source telling it and mentioning this, and we've got John telling it and mentioning this, and so forth, and then it appears to coincide. What they do is what I call reifying oral tradition. To reify is to take something and to make it into a thing when it's not really a thing. Okay, as if there was one apostle that told it that included all of these different aspects. Well, once again, that's just an ad hoc hypothesis. So to use the term oral tradition simply to mean all the stuff that people were saying that was out there, that's not a good counter to undesigned coincidences. Those are the two types of responses that I've mainly heard to various undesigned coincidences: that hypersubtle author and source type of response.
Yeah, now I'm really curious how this is going to interact with the cumulative case, because it's not just one undesigned coincidence, right? You've got to, it's really a case about, in your book, you go through a lot. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like this one account and how there's details that match up between the Gospels in this one example. There's multiple different things. You talk about the wine, the story of the wine skins. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different things that mm-hmm. all sort of point toward one direction. And so I'm really curious how these other responses are going to fare once you start to look at more than just one account.
Well, what you end up having to do, again, the ad hoc nature of it does become very obvious at that point, because you jump, maybe there was a source that had all of them for this one, and maybe there was another source that had all of the aspects for this one, and so forth, and that becomes, highly implausible. I mean, I had someone recently who was critiquing undesigned coincidences, and I gave a talk, and I had given a new one in the talk, and I don't think I'd ever given it before. It was not in the book. And so he came up to me at the end of the talk and he said, I'll think about that one some more. And, he was objecting to these. And so, that's fine. He's totally open, he's totally welcome to think about it some more. But there was definitely this feeling like, to me, what can I find to say, about this new one now, and so it doesn't, I think it doesn't fare very well, precisely because it is a cumulative case. Let me give another one here. And this one, again, people tend to really like, and I like it too. In Matthew 14, Matthew is doing the lead-in to the beheading of John the Baptist. And he's going to tell it as a flashback. Mark also tells it as a flashback. Herod is hearing about Jesus doing miracles and his disciples doing miracles. And Herod's really superstitious, and he says, this must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. And that is why these miracles are being done. And then it says, because Herod had beheaded John the Baptist. And then it goes and tells that story about how he was angry. John the Baptist was criticizing him for his marriage, and Herodias told her daughter to ask for John the Baptist's head. Very gruesome story. And so this is obviously bothering Herod. And but in Matthew, there's this little unique line. It says he said it to his servants. This must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. And that's only in Matthew. Otherwise, Matthew's actually very similar to Mark. It even looks like Matthew might have been partly kind of using Mark, so he didn't have to, write it all himself. There's no problem with plagiarism at that time or whatever. But he has this unique phrase. He said it to his servants. So we might think that Matthew is just, if you were a skeptic, you might think Matthew's just adding that to add realism to the account. Like he's if you read modern history, sometimes they'll throw in some, or a modern like curriculum or something, they'll throw in some kind of made up details just to make it more vivid or something like that. Who was he talking to? He said it to his servants. But when you go to, because after all, you might ask, how could Matthew possibly know what Herod was saying to his servants? He's got to be making this up. He doesn't have knowledge of what Herod is saying privately to his servants. Then you go to Luke 8. Now, Luke 8 is not about the beheading of John the Baptist. It's about some women who followed Jesus when he left Galilee, and they gave money to his ministry. And it starts listing them. Mary Magdalene it lists, and Susanna, I believe it lists. And it lists a woman named Joanna, and it says she was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. Luke just mentions this. He's just listing these women supporters of Jesus' ministry. So now we have an apparent connection between the Christians and Herod's top servant. And then over in Matthew, we have a statement about what Herod was saying to his servants. So it's entirely plausible that Chuza told Joanna this, and that one or the other of them, was apparently connected with the Christian movement and mentioned it to Matthew. Or that in some way connected with them, it got back to Matthew that this is what Herod was saying, and that he was saying it to his servants. This is a plausible connection and explanation, but neither document appears to be attempting to allude to the other one. There's absolutely no reason to think that Luke threw that in there. Like, maybe someone will notice that Matthew mentions that Herod said this to his servants, so in this totally different context, I'll mention Herod's household manager. That would be really implausible. So that's an example of how they seem to confirm one another.
Yeah, so if you're just joining us, we're talking about undesigned coincidences, which is a kind of internal evidence that the Bible is true, or at least the different gospel accounts. In your book, you also talk about the connections between the letters as well. So you can look at the Gospels, you can also look at undesigned coincidences in the letters of Paul and the other authors. So, well, do you have another one that you like to go over before we move on?
Sure, I'll do one from the letters, since you mentioned that. So it's undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And what I do in the book is I use Paul's letters to confirm Acts. Now, when William Paley coined this term, he had a book called the Horai Paulini, and that I read that book on a train, and that's like how I came to write my book. And he also used it to confirm the Pauline authorship of the epistles, which I think it does do. So you can read that in Paley. But I talked more about the way that it confirms the historicity of Acts. So here's one of my favorites. In Acts 19, verses 21 to 22, Paul is in Ephesus, and he's thinking about where he's going to go next. And he sends Timothy and Erastus from Ephesus into Macedonia. And I have maps in the book for this. So that would be sending them north and then overland and into Macedonia, which it sits on top of Greece. And he's sending them sort of ahead of him. And then it says that he himself was planning to go later into Macedonia and into ultimately what they call Achaia, which is modern Greece. So you'd be going north, you'd be going across, and then you'd be going down south into Greece. And he stays in Ephesus, Asia Minor, for a while, and he's going to go later. And he sends them ahead of him. All right. So there's this little bit in Acts. So Acts is telling us what Paul's associates are doing, where he's sending them, and even what his own travel intentions are that he's going to carry out later. Now you go to 1 Corinthians, and in chapter 4, he says, I have sent Timothy. Now, Corinth, of course, is in Greece. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he says, if Timothy comes, see that you treat him with respect. And he says, but I'm going to stay here. He says, I'm going to remain in Ephesus because a great door is opened for me, but there are many opponents. So it appears that he's writing from Ephesus. And so there's some reason then to think that the Epistle of 1 Corinthians was written from Ephesus to the Corinthians during this time, represented by Acts 19:21 to 22. I just want to mention here, the book of Acts never mentions that Paul wrote an epistle. It never mentions that. And yet I can place to the verse epistle after epistle from Paul based on these kinds of indirect indications, which is very, very cool. Now, notice that in Acts, it does not mention that he sent Erastus and Timothy ultimately into Greece. It just says he sent them into Macedonia, and he himself was going to go to Macedonia and into Greece. But it's entirely plausible that he intended them eventually to go on ahead of him to Greece. Now, here's this interesting thing. 1 Corinthians 16:10, if Timothy comes, see that you treat him with respect. What does that show us? Paul expects his letter to reach Corinth before Timothy, right? Because he's giving them instructions about how they are to treat Timothy if and when he eventually gets there. How does that work? How is that possible? Well, if you look at a map, you see that there's a sea route, and it was in fact a trade route from Ephesus right across to Corinth. So what was Paul going to do? He was going to put his letter on a boat and send it. He was very worried about the Corinthians, by the way, so he's going to want that to get there fast. He's going to send it across by sea. But Timothy is coming by land. So he's already sent him, but Timothy's going to get there later than the letter. So it's this wonderful indirect connection between the letter and the circumstances that are told in Acts, which gives us reason to believe that Acts is actually written by someone who really knows these details about what's going on in the life of the Apostle Paul.
So how many of these have you actually discovered yourself as opposed to reading them in someone like Paley? How many of these have you found on your own?
That's a very good question, because I found them from other people too. My husband has given me some. Other people, I have readers that write to me and suggest these to me. I've been finding some recently in an author named Leon Morris, who was a Johannine scholar. He doesn't use that word, but he is talking about it. I've probably only found like 4, maybe, all by myself. Wow. The majority of these, I am standing on the shoulders of giants, and I've collected from others. However, I do expand upon them. Like sometimes I might think this argument can be stated with more point to it, or it can be stated more forcefully, or I think I can make clearer to a modern audience why this is a good argument. So that's what I tried to do. I really tried to state them in as good and a punchy a way as possible.
So I want to let you guys know that we are going to go to Q&A. We still have a few more questions to talk about. One of the things I want to actually talk about is an objection that comes to my mind when we're thinking about undesigned coincidences. But if you guys have questions, save them. Don't do them right now because I'm not looking at the live chat. But I'll let you know as you're thinking of your questions, keep them in your mind, and I'll let you know when to start writing them in the live chat. Because I think right now we have about 180 people that are watching this live, so that's really cool. All right, so the objection that comes to my mind is this. So let's just grant it. Let's say that this does provide some evidence for historical reliability. But that doesn't mean that like everything that the Bible says is accurate or is true. So then the question is, how much evidence, even if we grant that it is evidence, how much evidence does this actually give us?
Sure. So what I tend to do is I tend to go at the level of books and the level of authors. So I think we can make an overwhelming argument, for example, that the author of Acts is also the author of Luke. It's the same person, whoever he was. So we want to talk about who these authors were. One of the great advantages that we have in the case of the Gospels and Acts is that each of these books appears to have been written by a single person. We can contrast this with, say, I don't know, 2 Kings. Okay, we may have a chronicler there who's compiled it, but he's using older chronicles. Now, I'm not saying that we can't argue for the reliability of 2 Kings, but what I'm saying is that it's not as clearly, even on a very conservative view, the product of a single mind, a single person, as the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is clearly the product of this guy, this one guy, whoever he was, whether we call him Luke or not. Same for the Gospel of John. In fact, liberal scholars will sometimes use the unity of style in the Gospel of John as some kind of argument against it. I'm not going to get into how they do that, but the point is it's obviously one guy. Okay, so what I say is let's look at what that guy was like. And let's use induction. We do this in daily life. If you have a friend, you probably don't start out suspecting your friend of being a liar, but even if you did, and you find your friend being confirmed over and over and over again, it would become unreasonable not to use induction. So I want to put these two things together. The concept of a book as the product of a mind and the concept of induction. So I like to use the analogy of a loaf of bread. You have a loaf of, say, cinnamon swirl bread, and you take a piece over here and you taste it and it's really good. And you take a piece from over here and you taste it and it's really good, and you're like sampling, okay? It would become unreasonable at a certain point for you to say, well, maybe it's just the piece that I haven't tasted that just really stinks. It's like, stale and disgusting and so forth. Obviously, this loaf was baked at a particular time in a particular bakery, and it's coming to you, you bought it at the store at a particular time, and it's reasonable to treat the properties as being the same throughout. So I think that's what we're doing with the Gospels, and it's what we're doing with the book of Acts. And then, as I say, the book of Acts reflects positively upon the reliability of Luke. I think that people do sometimes create in their own minds what I would call schizophrenic authors. So you'll have this author, and we're confirming him. I find this with John almost more than with any other gospel, but I find it with the other gospels sometimes too. We're confirming John, his archaeological details, his topographical, geographical details, his knowledge of Jerusalem. One of the things that Richard Bauckham says is, in John, we always know where Jesus is. And not just like in Jerusalem. It's like, no, he's near the sheep gate, So it's like really specific. And so we have all of this stuff that indicates this very historical intention and historical knowledge. And then we have undesigned coincidences. Remember, I said that about a cumulative case of cumulative cases, that we're building up these different types of evidence as well. And then people will go, well, maybe just at a certain point, John considered himself licensed to move this event. And it's like, is that how you would evaluate a person that you knew? If you knew someone personally and you found that again and again, he seemed to desire to tell the truth, he seemed to be really scrupulous about it, and he seemed to be getting it right, would you just randomly say, well, maybe there was just this one fine day that he said, I think I'm going to make something up, or I'm going to tell it to you with a completely straight face as if it really happened? That would seem to be an unreasonable, sort of out of the blue postulate. So that's the answer that I would give. I prefer not to say scripture, like let's see the reliability of all of scripture. Scripture was not written, it was written by God in some sense, but if we're evaluating these as historical documents, we think of them as written by different authors at different times. So let's think instead about whole book reliability. And I do believe that inductively, we can definitely confirm the very high reliability, strong reliability of books taken as a whole, and particularly the Gospels and Acts.
All right, well, we're about to move to live Q&A. And we have a couple more questions. So as the questions and everything start to pile in, then we're going to move on to Q&A. But in the meantime, let me just give you guys some rules for the live Q&A. So ask your questions in the live chat. There's going to be one question per person. Try to limit it to just your best question. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, so just give me your best. Tag at Capturing Christianity. That way I can make sure to see your questions. Make sure that your question is on topic to Undesigned Coincidences. And then super chat questions are going to be bumped to the top of this. So the question is, what kind of work are you working on right now? Mm-hmm. And how is it relevant? You've talked about this, at least in our private chats, is that it's very relevant to Undesigned Coincidences.
Yeah, I definitely think they're connected. So Hidden in Plain View was published in 2017. It came out just about exactly 3 years ago now. We're going on 3 years. In December of 2019, on December 10th, a new book came out that I wrote called The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. So this really extends the project of Hidden in Plain View. And you get a little hint of this in my answer to the previous question. Something that I said in Hidden in Plain View is that undesigned coincidences tell us something about who these authors were. And the way I put that there was that they had primarily a testimonial project. What was their project? Their project was testimonial, to tell what happened, to tell the story of Jesus truthfully. And I've coined since then a term for that, which I call the reportage model, but it's the same concept as what I was talking about in Hidden in Plain View, that these are truthful authors and that they get things right. It's a very, very broad way of describing that reportage model. There are bells and whistles. There are nuances to that I give in The Mirror or the Mask, but that's in broad terms. Now, what I've learned about, I was already learning about this at the time that Hidden in Plain View came out, but I've researched this far more. Some claims that are becoming more popular in the evangelical world from scholars such as Michael Licona, Craig Evans, and some others, that the gospel authors consider themselves licensed by the standards of their time at times to alter facts deliberately. So a pretty famous example here is the claim that John moved the year of the cleansing of the temple by about 3 years, 3.5 years. And so that he's narrating it very realistically in his gospel, in which you might call the story world of his gospel, but that in fact it happened at a different time. That would just be one of many examples. So these are Christian scholars who are adopting this, that the gospel authors sometimes did that. So then in The Mirror or the Mask, I respond to those arguments that are given for that, many different layers. I go back into the Greco-Roman literature. And then I also bring forward more positive evidence for the reliability in this very high sense of reliability and that reportage model. I bring forward more undesigned coincidences, some new ones that were not in Hidden in Plain View. And so I have a positive and a negative side. And here's The Mirror or the Mask.
And tell me more about the name of the book, because the name of it is actually apparent until you start to read it a little bit.
Right. So you can see the mask is in front of Jesus' face, or it's like as if it is almost coming in front of it, or it could be being lifted off. I had that deliberately ambiguously, that you can think of it either way. Either it's coming onto his face or being lifted off of his face. So a mirror is a object that gives us a picture of someone, and it does it by natural means. So if the Gospels are mirrors of Jesus, then they're giving us an accurate picture of Jesus by the natural means of witness testimony. In the case of, say, Luke or Mark, that witness testimony might be at like one remove. They weren't eyewitnesses themselves, but they're recording eyewitness testimony. And so by this natural means of truthful testimony, we're getting a picture of Jesus. That's a mirror. A mask would be like an agenda that the author would have that would, to some degree at least, obscure the truth. Because if they change these things, so maybe one of the authors changed the day of Jesus' crucifixion, or maybe invented some dialogue, or invented some words for Jesus to say that he did not recognizably say, or something like that, then that would make it somewhat fuzzier. It would take that view of him, and we would say, well, did he really say that? So if a pastor goes to preach on Sunday morning, he's going to preach on Jesus saying, let's say, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink, just to pick something like that. If that pastor has heard of these literary device theories, he would have, I think, and if he's believed them, if the pastor thinks that these seem plausible, he would have a legitimate question: did Jesus really say in a historically recognizable way? Yes, it might have been in another, language. Obviously, he wasn't speaking English. He probably may not even have been speaking Greek, but in a way that you could have recognized if you were there. If anyone thirsts, let him come unto me and drink. The pastor could legitimately say, well, I don't really know if that happened. So I don't want to be telling my congregation this and then basing this application for their lives on it if it didn't really happen. So that would be the mask on the historical Jesus. I use a phrase, I think I may have gotten this from my husband, the redactive fog. That if you have these redactive theories that they're changing things, then it's like a fog. So, but I don't want people to think of the book as entirely negative. It's very clearly divided. And then I also deal with a lot of alleged contradictions in the Gospels and give my own explanations of those alleged contradictions. Then what I'm working on right now is yet a third book. It's going to be called The Eye of the Beholder, and I'm really excited about that. I'm drafting that, trying to finish up the drafting on that. That's entirely about John. There's a lot of John material in The Mirror of the Mask as well, and there's a ton of John material in Hidden in Plain View. But The Eye of the Beholder is going to be entirely about John, because John comes in for some special questions or some special allegations that he altered things, or that John's just different. He's just different from the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I try to answer that. And again, I have yet more additional undesigned coincidences in The Eye of the Beholder that are new, that aren't in either of the other books. So that's kind of exciting too.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And by the way, both of the books, Undesigned Coincidences and Mirror or the Mask. Is that it? Mirror or the Mask?
Or the Mask. Mm-hmm.
Or the Mask they're both linked in the description of this video. All right, well, let's get into some Q&A here. So we have the first question from Sage. He says, does the undesigned coincidence argument require the rejection of the more literary view of Gospels genre as Greco-Roman biography?
I think if a person believes that Greco-Roman biography just means biography, if that's just like another word that you're using for biography, I wish you wouldn't do that. But if that's what you mean by it, then that's not necessarily a problem. I think there are a lot of people out there who just think that Greco-Roman biography means it just means that this is a truthful biography of Jesus. In fact, a lot of people thought that identification of the Gospels as that genre was entirely supportive of their historical accuracy. But when you get into what is intended by it, as he put it, a more literary view, then I would say there is a definite tension. Now, necessitates, there are all kinds of logical possibilities out there. You remember I earlier talked about a schizophrenic author. You could have an author who, most of the time he's telling the truth just in this honest fashion, and then one day he up and changes something. That's a logical possibility, but it's not the way to bet. So I would say, and these are all empirical arguments. These are all non-deductive arguments. From a non-deductive point of view, yes, I would say these two views of the Gospels are going in very opposite directions. And what the literary theorists think of as Greco-Roman biography, the way I put it, they're saying there's a floor. The Gospels are no less historical than this. They're not just novels or something. They really are, in an important sense, historicals. They don't get any less historical than this. But they also, the way I put it is, they say there's a ceiling. They don't use that term. That's my term. But that it doesn't get more historical than this. That there's very probably at least some places, and in fact, Dr. Lacona, Dr. Evans, they actually suggest quite a few places where the authors are, to some extent, changing history because of their genre. I have a chapter in The Mirror of the Mask. I'm very pleased with this chapter. I call it Evidence and the Artless Author. And what I do is I go through various bits of both external and internal evidence for the Gospels, and I show how the literary device approach can sort of blind you to the way that this evidence confirms the Gospels, because the scholar will come in with I won't necessarily say a hard and fast assumption, but a bit of a tendency or a bias toward expecting it to not be factually accurate. And then that causes him not to notice that it's actually confirmed. And I find that a really interesting chapter, and it's where I use quite a number of undesigned coincidences. So in that sense, the answer would be, yes, these are in tension with one another.
All right, so the next question that we have, and I'm going to pull up my screen back here, is Bible History Science. It's from Bible History Science. He says, has she found undesigned coincidences about the rapture?
That's an interesting one. The thing is, the rapture hasn't happened yet. Okay, so when I'm talking about undesigned coincidences, I'm generally talking about an event that's being reported. So in that sense, I would be inclined to say no, because it's not an event that's being reported because it hasn't already happened. Now, the person might be thinking of, I'm trying to think, there was a scholar I saw the other day. It was talking about differences, so that one author says that, we're going to be received up in, Paul says, be caught up together with him. And then another verse talks about Jesus' feet landing on the Mount of Olives, and are these different second comings and that kind of thing. That's interesting, but because it hasn't happened yet, I would say we can conjecture about how those go together. So in that sense, I would be inclined to say no to that question.
All right, next question is from Mordic101. He says, ask her why she and her husband don't write a popular level book summarizing their maximal facts argument. It would be really great and is needed right now.
Well, in some ways, I would say Hidden in Plain View is somewhat popular level. If you compare Hidden in Plain View to The Mirror or The Mask, it's definitely a lot smaller. And what I meant it to be was I meant it to appeal to what I would call a crossover audience that could be both popular and scholarly. I meant it to have sort of something for everyone. And that's a little harder to argue for The Mirror or The Mask. I think The Mirror or The Mask takes a little more commitment. I guess I tend to think that a maximal data approach is composed of so many different lines that you can spend a whole book, on each line. And what I would suggest that people do would be to look at certain sections of The Mirror or The Mask and look at some of those additional types of lines of evidence, such as unexplained allusions, unnecessary details, incidental external confirmations, and that kind of thing, and compose your own favorites, where you're doing this cumulative case made up of cumulative cases, and you've got a few of these and a few of these and a few of these, and you're ready, you're loaded for bear. And I think that those are written at a level that actually can be understood popularly, even if the book as a whole might appear a little bit daunting. One reviewer really warmed my heart. Tom Gilson said, I'm reading this book and I'm wondering why I'm not bored. I really appreciated that. He says, how is it that you're discussing all of this stuff, this rather dusty, difficult stuff, and you're not being boring? So that is something for me to try to live up to. I hope I can live up to that when I write The Eye of the Beholder as well.
Yeah, a friend of mine actually mentioned something very, very similar to that. Is that it was just a very sort of gripping book. And it was weird because it's very analytical. It's very philosophical, very carefully argued. So anyways, yeah, check out the link in the description if you guys want to pick up that book as well. All right, next question from JD. He says, what are some undesigned coincidences in the book of Revelation?
Well, of course, the book of Revelation, again, is talking about a lot of things that haven't happened, but there is one, I would call it a external confirmation. And again, you could expand your notion of external confirmations and say they're sort of like undesigned coincidences. When Jesus says to the church, and I believe it's the church at Laodicea, you think that you are rich and that you see, but I say that you are poor and wretched and blind. That, by the way, is where some of the words came to just as I am, poor, wretched, blind. Anyway, from Revelation. When you go back in history, you find that there was a earthquake that took place in that valley near where Laodicea was, and they rebuilt themselves. They were so rich that they turned down federal aid, what we would call federal disaster aid from the Roman government. And they're like, no, no, thank you, really. We'll take care of this ourselves. Sounds like some town in Texas or something. And they rebuilt themselves because they were so well off. And then there was also an eye salve that was from there. And they, were known for this. Now, I hope I'm not getting Laodicea wrong. I haven't looked it up, but it's one of the churches that Jesus is speaking to. And he says, you say that you were rich and that you see, and you are poor and wretched and blind. And so that fits with what we know about the history, that Jesus is sort of insulting them based upon what he knows that they're actually proud of and they're actually pleased with about themselves. So that's kind of cool in what you might call that frame section of Revelation, those letters to the churches at the beginning.
All right, let's move on to the next question. We have a few more. Oh, and by the way, if you guys have a question, we're sort of at our limit here. So if you have a question, you want to make sure that it does get over to Dr. Lydia, then make sure to do a super chat. That's the only way to get it, sort of bump it up the queue here. So next question is from Gordon Tubbs, which, by the way, he is one of our Bereans. He's a supporter of Capturing Christianity. He's in the Bereans Facebook group, and he's always offering great ideas and everything in the little post that we make on Facebook. So really appreciate your insight and your thoughts and your questions, Gordon. So here it is. He says, what is a quick point you would raise in response to one of Bart Ehrman's ideas that the Gospels were largely propaganda?
Well, you'll see that I give examples in my books of things that they do that don't really fit with their being propaganda. So I'm going to give you an example here from the Gospel of John. This is going to make it into the book that I'm writing right now. The Jewish accusers say to Pontius Pilate, he claimed that he was the Son of God. We say that he's blasphemed, he ought to die because he said that he was the Son of God. And it says at that Pilate was the more afraid, and he went back and he said to Jesus, where are you from? He's a Roman. The Romans think that there can be like sons of the gods, and he doesn't want to crucify this guy if he's a son of the gods. And Jesus doesn't answer him. He refuses to answer him. And then Pilate says, don't you know that I have the power to release you or to have you crucified? And they have this little dialogue about Pilate's authority. Notice what Jesus does not do. He does not launch into a discussion of his being the Son of God. Now, we find scholars will say that John has these themes and that he wants to propagandize on these themes. Like Jesus being the Son of God is a huge Johannine theme, beginning with the preface to John's Gospel. This would have been a perfect opportunity to insert a propagandistic discourse by Jesus on, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I am the Son of God. I'm from above. Jesus is always talking about being from above, and he doesn't. So we find the restraint of the gospel authors actually far more often than their propagandistic tendencies. And I note these points. I have many other points like this. For example, that the gospels don't tell the scene of Jesus meeting with Peter after his resurrection. The restraint of the gospel authors that actually argues against there being propaganda.
All right, let's get on to the last. I guess we have a couple more questions, so 3 total. I think if you have time for it,
I definitely do. And I also want to urge people: feel free to follow me on Facebook. You do not have to be my Facebook friend. I leave a lot of Facebook friend requests just sort of unresponded to if I don't know you, but you can follow my public content. And if you have questions, you can also email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com, and ask me questions. If you do that, please introduce yourself. Just tell me a little bit about who you are, if you're a Christian or unbeliever or a seeker or whatever, so I know whom I'm talking to. So if your question doesn't get addressed here, feel free to write to me.
All right, we had a super chat from Converse Contender. He says, what do you think of 2 Peter being left out of the church fathers list?
So there was some controversy about whether 2 Peter was written by Peter, the authorship of 2 Peter. I think that it was written by Peter. There's a book called the Horai Petroni, and I think it's by a guy named Burks, T.R. Burks, if I recall correctly. This is one of these 19th century authors, these old authors that my husband Tim's always talking about. And it's free out there because it's not in copyright anymore. And he talks about evidence for the authorship of Second Peter, things that Peter would have known or that would have been on his mind. For example, the emphasis upon the transfiguration, which was something that Peter was personally present on, or the emphasis upon you were a sheep going astray. I believe that's in Second Peter, if I recall correctly. And Jesus said to Peter, "Feed my sheep." And so I would definitely say that Second Peter is by Peter. I don't see any reason to think that. If I recall correctly, I believe Richard Bauckham thinks that it's pseudepigraphical, and I have read his argument. I'm not convinced by his argument. But the interesting thing is that if you say something pseudepigraphical, then what you are admitting is that it's been given the appearance that it's written by Peter. So I think that's sort of a concession in and of itself. I think that's interesting.
All right, next question is from Jamie Logan. He or she says, isn't it ad hoc to harmonize, for example, the two contradictory Judas death accounts instead of accepting that one must be false?
The question of ad hocness is very interesting. It's an area of my professional publication. So I have an article on Bayes' theorem and the analysis of ad hocness in a European analytic philosophy journal. Very interesting question of ad hocness. What we find is that in history, when you have, and I do this with secular documents as well, when you have two documents and you have some reason to believe that they are accurate, that they're both accurate, that they come from people who are in the know, and there is an apparent discrepancy or an apparent contradiction, it does become legitimate to see if they can be harmonized. That's not desperate. Now, there is some prima facie discrepancy between the accounts of Judas's death. I would not claim that there is no apparent or prima facie discrepancy. But what we do is we look at the independent probability of their of possible harmonizations, and that's a legitimate historical thing to do. I call harmonization good historical practice. People think that you do it because you're an inerrantist or something, and you're just desperate to reconcile these. I harmonize Plutarch, and I have no desperateness to reconcile Plutarch. But that's just a good way of doing historical practice. I was very impressed by a point about the death of Judas that Peter J. Williams, the British New Testament scholar, made on the Unbelievable show when he had a dialogue with Bart Ehrman. He said, just in Acts alone, where it says that his is that Acts? Yeah, that his guts fell out, and his came out. He says, if you just fell, it says he fell headlong, your guts are not going to fall out. If you just trip on a rock or something, that's not going to happen. So he says already, just in the account in Acts, we have some reason to think that there's some kind of a height here, that there's, he's falling from a height, or something's happening besides just an ordinary tripping and falling, or else his guts.
Yeah, and I think that the authors back in that day, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think to add to this, I think they were actually more familiar with death and what could happen to someone's body after they were dead, because death was a little bit more open and exposed back then. So they'd have a little bit more insight into what sort of things could or would happen to someone's dead body.
Absolutely. But what's interesting, and I liked this point of Peter's, that it's not ad hoc to say, so there must be more to the story. Like already you read Acts and you're like, there must be more to the story. So then when you go and you read Matthew, you can actually think of him as sort of explaining it, because he says that he hung himself. Well, then now there's our height, that he hung himself. So I think that's actually very interesting. So in general, harmonizing apparent discrepancies is a good way of carrying out historical practice. That does not mean that every one of them can be harmonized. That doesn't mean that there are no bad harmonizations, but I don't happen to think this is a bad one.
All right, well, we have one more question that we're going to go to, but before I do that, just want to let everyone know again, if you want to support me and my work and what I'm doing here, You can go over to my Patreon, patreon.com/capturing Christianity. You can gain access to the Bereans Facebook group. $5 a month grants you access there. We have really cool, fun discussions there. All right, let's pop back over here. So the last question for today's live stream is from Epic Christ, which Epic, by the way, I really appreciate you commenting. You're always in the live chat, and you actually ask some really and make some really interesting comments. So I really appreciate you hanging out on the channel and asking your questions. All right. Question is, since you are an analytic philosopher, have you ever used your knowledge of that when it comes to the Bible?
Yeah, I do it all the time. As a matter of fact, so you just saw this with ad hocness and the concept of ad hocness. I try not to get really technical. There are no equations in any of these books, but so for example, I just published an article in the journal Familias. It was on multiple attestation. So if you're interested in apologetics, you'll often hear references to multiple attestation. That it's in different, some events is in different gospels. It's multiply attested or something like that. And I've been doing a lot of work on multiple attestation in a purely secular area. What counts as multiple attestation, and how do we have to be careful in alleging that? So I argue in that article that people are not always being quite careful enough. So, for example, if you say that Paul in 1 Corinthians is independently attesting to the empty tomb, well, I'm not sure that's true, because I think he probably learned about the empty tomb from the disciples. And even if he is alluding to the fact that the tomb was empty, the disciples also lie behind our accounts in the Gospels. So the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is not an independent attestation to the empty tomb. Now, that's something I learned from my work in analytic philosophy. I'm also talking about things like simplicity. So in The Mirror or the Mask, a lot of times when I'm disagreeing with these literary theories, what I'm saying is you guys are preferring more complex theories, and there's a simpler theory that you should use instead. And that, again, it's my field. A lot of times what I would say is scholars in fields like New Testament studies, they're doing applied epistemology. They're doing applied theory of knowledge, but they're sometimes making mistakes. And so in a sense, I can bring that outsider perspective, and then I also have to do my homework, obviously, to know the relevant texts and the relevant material. But by doing my homework, then I can also bring that outsider perspective of analytic philosophy and apply it there to these concepts like evidence, reliability, simplicity, and so forth, to try to sharpen up our knowledge of the Bible. And that's what I'm trying to do, because I think we all want to know the truth about the Bible.
Yeah, and I want to say that I think it's really important that we have analytic philosophers like Lydia and Tim thinking about these questions, because they can see sort of gaps in reasoning that maybe a historian can't see, because they're not trained in thinking about logic and making sure that everything is sort of following these steps in this logical order. So I really appreciate the work of people like Lydia and Tim and other analytic philosophers that are thinking about the New Testament and thinking as rigorously as they are. We need more of that. We need more of that from, and historians, I don't think we should necessarily expect that from them, because that's not their field necessarily. They're there to make creative connections, I guess, if you want to even put it that way. Anyways, I think it's really important that we have people like Lydia doing this kind of work.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a webinar. I have a number of webinars. You can check my page, lydiamcgrew.com, and several of them were done at Apologetics Academy, and they're all kind of interesting. One of them is called 6 Bad Habits of New Testament Scholars and How to Avoid Them. So that's from a couple of years ago, where I'm trying to kind of do that, to kind of sharpen up the field for New Testament studies using analytic philosophy.
Is there anything else that you'd like to leave with our audience before we close this one out?
No, just thank you so much for having me. Please follow me on Facebook and get in touch with your further questions. And please get a hold of a copy of my books. I suppose one other thing I would mention concerning The Mirror or the Mask, I put chapter summaries at the end of each chapter in there. And I did that on purpose. I kind of took an informal survey of my my Facebook followers. What do you guys think? And they were in favor of that. So I want to encourage you, if you feel that the book looks long, please don't let that stop you from getting a hold of it and browsing. And you can use chapter summaries to decide where you want then to drill down more and read. Of course, I would love it if you read the whole book, but that's not absolutely necessary. And there are tools in there that can help you to get the big picture of where I'm going there as well.
All right. So yeah, go check her out on Facebook. Check out the links in the description to the 2 books. And I want to just thank you guys again for tuning in to the live stream today. Actually, this is the first of a live stream that we're going to be doing every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. So mark that down in your calendars if you want to be part of our weekly live stream now, which is a really cool upgrade that we just made very recently. So make sure to mark that down in your calendar. Next week, I actually don't have a slide up, but next week we're talking about Rhett and Link. Rhett and Link are 2 Christian YouTubers, or 2 ex-Christian YouTubers, who recently went through a spiritual deconstruction and are now sort of falling away from the faith. So we're doing our live stream on that topic. And if you want to see that and join us, then you can actually just look for it on the YouTube channel. It's already up. I have Dr. Braxton Hunter coming on with me from Trinity Radio. So that's all really exciting. If you want to see that, then check just go to the channel page, basically. And until then, we'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.